Hello everyone, and welcome to our very last lecture here. This portion of the lecture we're just going to cover the anatomy of the brain and functions of parts of the brain. So a lot of this is probably going to sound and seem very familiar because we talked about many of these structures in the anatomy portion of our class and lab. So a lot of this stuff you saw last week and some the week before that. So there are 6 regions of the brain that I want you to know. These 6 regions of the brain, they pretty much correspond with those same lobes of the brain. It's just that we separate them a little bit differently. The cerebrum, as you probably already remember, is the bulk of the brain, the mass of it. And then you have the cerebellum, which is that little tail in the back, and it has that transverse fissure that goes through there. The diencephalon, the mesencephalon, those are different lobes. They would take up different lobes of the brain. The pons is starting of the brain stem, and remember on the sheep brains it was that first hump, and the same thing on our models. The pons was the first hump, and then the medulla oblongata was the second hump on the brain. So the diencephalon and the mesencephalon, those 2 terms may seem as if they're new, but they're really just a different way to describe regions of the brain. So for the mesencephalon, we'll talk about the thalamus and the hypothalamus and all of that. So they're really just portions of the brain that are embedded within the parietal and the occipital lobes. So as we've already established, the largest part of the brain is the cerebrum. It controls your higher mental functions, and when we say higher mental functions, we're talking about things like learning and memory, being able to see a letter and recognize that letter is a letter and then attach a sound to it. So those are higher order mental functions. Your cerebrum is divided into your left and your right hemisphere, and it's divided by your corpus callosum, which is that tract of tissue that connects the left and the right sides of your brain. The cerebellum is the second largest part, so that's the smaller tail end in the back. The job of the cerebellum is primarily to the coordination of repetitive body movements. So things like walking, writing, anything that you do driving, all of that is the role of the cerebellum. We can have what's called cerebellar ataxia, which means that there is the inability of the cerebellum to work properly, and all sorts of things can cause that. A blood clot can cause a stroke in the cerebellum that can interrupt those repetitive body movements. Excessive drinking, because alcohol can cross the blood-brain barrier. It can also, cause ataxia, and that's why if you drink, you should not drive, and sometimes it's even difficult to walk because it affects your cerebellum. On the outside of it, you have the cerebellar cortex of it. So that's just kind of the outer covering. We didn't see that in our brains and our models because it doesn't have that connective tissue. And we just removed it when we took the dura mater off in our sheep brains. So the diencephalon, which is kind of the middle part of the brain a little bit, when you cut the brain in half, and remember we looked up from where the pituitary gland would be connected, and we saw that round circular mass that we said was the thalamus. The job of the thalamus is to be a relay center, so it can relay and process sensory information. So when a stimulus comes into the thalamus, whether it be for vision, for hearing, for sight, or sight vision, or for movements, it will take that sensory information, process it to where it's supposed to go. So it's kind of a relay station. So if it's for something like sight or vision, then that information will be processed back to the occipital lobe, which is the back lobe of the cerebrum. If it's something for hearing or auditory processing, it would go towards the temporal lobes. For any other higher mental function, let's say you're looking at a letter and you need to recognize that's a letter, there are different parts. You have verbal and written communication centers in your brain. So the thalamus is a big job, and it's a huge job. If there's damage to your thalamus, it's very difficult for a person to live a normal life. It's because it processes and relays all of that sensory information. So any of the things, the information that comes into the brain, it goes directly to the thalamus, and then the thalamus then relays that information to which part of the brain is responsible for handling that. The hypothalamus is the lower portion of that thalamus, and it doesn't really have that same relay and process sensory information sort of job that the thalamus does, the major mass of it. Its bigger job is for hormone production. And the two hormones that we talked about the hypothalamus producing are the regulating and the inhibiting hormones, which directly impact or relate to how much or how little or when the pituitary gland releases any of its 9 hormones. Because it has an effect on how much of the hormones that are released by the pituitary gland, the hypothalamus is also believed to have a role in emotion. So emotion and feelings, there's a different portion of your brain that's more concerned with that, but we do believe that it has a role to play in some of that because it does have so much effect over the pituitary gland, the master endocrine gland, on what type of hormones are released. So the pituitary gland is not really part of the brain. Remember, it's its own endocrine tissue, but because it sticks or connects directly to that hypothalamus via that stalk or infundibulum, we include it in with this discussion. So if you remember from last week when we looked at our sheep brains and we took the dura mater off, we kind of peeled off the pituitary gland and we snapped that infundibulum. So it just interfaces between the nervous system and the exocrine system. The brain stem, the mesencephalon, also called the midbrain, processes information such as sight, sound, and associated reflexes. For sight and for sound, if something is coming towards you, you have a tendency to blink. We talked about that reflex on our last week with our discussion. We also know that if there's a very loud sound, a loud smash or a clap or anything like that, it triggers your startle reflex and you will jump as a result of that. So your midbrain has a role to play in that. It also helps to maintain your consciousness. And as we go a little bit further out, we see the pons, which is involved primarily in somatic and visceral motor control. So there are several of your cranial nerves that come out of the pons, and they have a bigger job in kind of motor control. So they're sending information out through the efferent system, whereas with the thalamus, it's primarily getting information into the brain and relays it to different parts, sensory information in, and relays it to different parts of the brain to coordinate the appropriate response. What hangs out at the very end of like right behind the pons, we have the medulla oblongata. And if you've ever seen the classic movie Waterboy, you probably remember Bobby Boucher having an argument with his professor in biology class, and the professor talks about how he asked the question of why are alligators so angry, and Bobby Boucher, Adam Sandler's character, says, well, their mama says they're so angry because they have all those teeth. And that's obviously incorrect, and the professor corrected him, and they laughed at him, and this is like 2 seconds before the professor gets tackled by Bobby Boucher. But he says the medulla oblongata is a center. The reason they are so angry is because they have an enlarged medulla oblongata, and that's only partially true. The medulla oblongata in some lower reptiles, it does have a role in anger and aggression because it is the oldest part of the brain itself. So we see that organisms that have a larger medulla oblongata tend to have less of the higher order processing portions of the brain, so they don't really have the same ability to control their anger and aggression and things of that nature. However, it's not solely because they have a large medulla oblongata that alligators are so angry, and angry is kind of an anthropomorphic term to relate to alligators, so the better term would be to be aggressive. So anywho, that was my little pop culture fact for you there. The medulla oblongata's job is to allow for communication between the brain and the spinal cord to take place, because the medulla oblongata is right between the pons, and then which is part of the mesencephalon, and the spinal cord on the inferior end of it. It does, like the pons, control some visceral function. It also is able to have relay information for not only sensory information that comes in, but it also has motor pathways for information to go out. So keeping in mind that the medulla oblongata is responsible for coordinating and the coordination and communication between the brain and the spinal cord, it would make sense that if it has tracks for sensory information to come in via the afferent system, and it relays that information to the other parts of the brain, and then when the brain gives the appropriate response on how your body should respond to it, whether it's by movement or the activation of glands or muscles, then that information is also sent to the medulla oblongata and is relayed to different cranial or spinal nerves for those motor pathways. So really big part of what the medulla oblongata does, specifically in human and higher order primates' brain, is it's for communication between the brain and the spinal cord. So the pons links the cerebellum with the mesencephalon, the diencephalon, cerebrum, and the spinal cord. So much like the medulla oblongata, it has a role in coordinating and also communication between different parts of the brain. As I said before, there are quite a few cranial nerves that are on the pons. Cranial nerve 5, 6, 7, and 8 are all cranial nerves that we find coming out of the pons. Now, we didn't see that in lab class because we didn't look at the human brain models and find the cranial nerves there, but you should have been able to see that on the picture in your textbook that I told you all to study for your lab practical. You should be able to see that there are quite a few cranial nerves that come out of the pons. So the cerebellum, the little part in the back, as we said before, coordinates learning reflexive patterns of muscular activity. It does it at a subconscious level, so repetitive body movements, walking, driving, the movement of your tongue and your mouth when you talk. When you speak one language is different from the movement of the tongue in your mouth when you speak another language. So those will all be coordinated efforts that would be the role of the cerebellum. Disorders of the cerebellum we call ataxia. Most common cause of ataxia is intoxication, which is a very temporary impairment, and it can disturb muscle coordination. But for individuals who've had strokes in their cerebellum where the blood vessel will burst and it kind of not enough oxygen is getting to the parts of the cerebellum, to any part of the cerebellum, that can also cause ataxia, which is just disruptive, uncoordinated, very sporadic muscle coordination. So that's one of the reasons why they say buzz driving is drunk driving, because if you're even slightly intoxicated, it does impair your judgment and it does impair the ability of your cerebellum to coordinate those repetitive movements. So if you've ever seen somebody who's drunk, walking can sometimes even be somewhat problematic. They may think they're walking in a straight line, but really they are not. So the most common form of this that we see is during intoxication. Diencephalon, that thalamus portion there, and the hypothalamus that we've already talked about, integrates sensory information and motor commands as well. So the thalamus does have, as we've already established, sensory information comes in, but at the same time we have to remember that motor commands also have to come out and be relayed through that. So when we think diencephalon, I want you to think about thalamus, epithalamus, and hypothalamus. Those are the portions of the diencephalon. Also, what gland we haven't really talked about, and remember the pituitary and this gland we're going to talk about now, which we did talk about in the endocrine chapter, the pineal gland is not really a part of the brain, but it is found in the brain. It's its own tissue. So the pineal gland, which kind of hangs out, it's posterior to where the thalamus lies, and it's superior and posterior to where the hypothalamus lies. It secretes the hormone melatonin, which is responsible for circadian rhythms and also has a role in reproductive function. Around the hypothalamus, we have the mammillary bodies, which once we close our brain up, we would be able to see those little pads there. They're right on the outside of the hypothalamus. They surround the infundibulum. The mammillary bodies process olfactory and other sensory information that comes into the brain. They can also control reflective eating movement. So when you eat, your tongue rolls the food around in your mouth, and that's a reflective eating movement. For babies, kind of when they're suckling, that tongue thrust that takes place for infants, that is a reflexive eating movement as well. You also, so in between the mammillary bodies, you have two of them, one on the left side and the right side. You have the infundibulum, and that's the stalk that connects the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. And you have the tubal area, which is even smaller, which we did not talk about. Both mammillary bodies and infundibulum we saw in lab class. The tubal area, it's even smaller. It's between between the infundibulum and the mammillary bodies, and it just helps to control pituitary gland function. So that's kind of the site of the hypothalamus where the releasing and the inhibiting hormones are going to be released from. For functions of the hypothalamus, one we've already talked about, doesn't really secrete these hormones, but it releases hormones that will tell the pituitary gland to release it. So in a roundabout way, yeah, the hypothalamus does release antidiuretic and oxytocin hormone. And the reason that we go ahead and say yes, it's the hypothalamus that does that is because A, it releases the hormones it says to release it, and this is part of the part of the pituitary gland where ADH and oxytocin are released from is called the neural hyphosis, and the neural hyphosis has like direct tracks to the hypothalamus itself. From here on out, the remainder of your textbook is going to give the job, because you will talk about antidiuretic and oxytocin again next semester. It's going to give this job where it says, where does this hormone come from? It's going to say the hypothalamus. But I want you to recognize that technically it's released from the pituitary gland. So along with secreting hormones or regulating the secretion of hormones, it provides subconscious control over your skeletal muscle. It controls much of your autonomic function, so the parts of your brain that don't the parts of your brain that are responsible for doing things that keep you alive and you breathing and your heart beating and you not having to consciously think about those things. It's in part some of the part of the hypothalamus, and it definitely coordinates activities between the nervous and the endocrine system because of those releasing inhibiting hormones that are secreted by the hypothalamus. The limbic system really isn't one single anatomical portion of the brain. So far when we talked about the diencephalon, the mesencephalon, the hypothalamus, the thalamus, the cerebrum, the cerebellum, all of those are anatomical regions of the brain. The limbic system isn't really an anatomical region that you can just find on a model or on a dissection of a brain. It's more of a functional grouping. And the job of that functional grouping is to establish emotional states. Now we've said that some of that has been the job of the hypothalamus, that it can also help to establish some emotional states there. But really, the limbic system is its primary responsibility is the establishment of emotional states. It helps to link the conscious function of your cerebral cortex with the autonomic functions of the brain. So for example, if you smell something, like if you go into an elementary school and it's been several years since you've gone into an elementary school, that smell may trigger memories of being in school, or smelling the cafeteria may trigger memories of being in school. Seeing a picture of someone you haven't seen for many years may trigger that memories and things of that nature. So the limbic system, not only does it establish emotional states, but it kind of links memories with auditory and visual and even olfactory processing. So it helps to facilitate memory storage and memory retrieval. The limbic system is really a very fascinating functional grouping here, and we've always said that the brain is kind of the final frontier in human anatomy and physiology. We know a whole lot about it, but we don't quite know everything yet. The cerebrum, the largest part of the brain, controls conscious thought and intellectual functions, and it does process somatic, sensory, and motor information. So information that comes in gets processed by the cerebrum. You burn your hand, or let's say you burn your hand on something. You touch something slimy, and in your mind, it's Halloween, so you touch something slimy, so you're thinking, ew, this might be brain guts or something in there. So you would draw your hand away. That's kind of part of that processing of information. Integrative centers are located on each of the lobes in your brain and the cortical areas of both your left and your right cerebral hemisphere. They receive information from association areas. So you have what's called the Wernicke's area, and you have associating areas and integrative centers for verbal communication, for written communication. So these integrative areas will take that information that's come from these association areas, and it will coordinate that information and then direct the complex motor response. Very good example of this is when you take a test. So when you take a test, first thing you have to do is read the question. In reading, we take this for granted. It is a very complex process. So you have to be able to read what the word says, figure out whether those are letters or numbers. So you have association areas in your brains that tell you, is this a letter, is this a number? Oh, it's a letter. Let's go to a different association part of your brain. Then making out the sound of that letter. So if it's analytical, then analytical. So that's a different association area. And then the integrative centers kind of put it all together and say, oh, this word says analytical, and the word analytical means kind of a logical step. So then you're interpreting. So we do it very quickly. We just look at a sentence, directs complex motor and analytical activities. You look at it very quickly, and you take for granted all of the work that's happening in your brain to make this take place. So then, even after you've read the sentence, you still need to, or the question on your test, you still need to be able to retrieve that information from other integrative centers. So you have several integrated centers embedded throughout your brain, and you have multiple association areas that help you to process written, verbal, and various different forms of communication. So your general interpretive area, called your Wernicke area, is only in one hemisphere, receives information from all the sensory association areas, and it complexes access to complex visual and auditory memories. So when you're retrieving the information on, oh, I remember where the pons is found, it was that first big hump, that's part of your Wernicke area's job. Speech centers, other integrative areas, it's associated with the general interpretive area because that's the largest one, but it coordinates the vocal, all vocalization functions in your speech center. So how a word should be pronounced, how it is pronounced, how you've heard it pronounced, all of that, the way that your tongue is going to move as it's pronounced. Those integrative areas kind of are, they're part of the speech center. Prefrontal cortex of the frontal lobe integrates information from the sensory areas, and this is really cool. That prefrontal cortex is a really cool part of the frontal lobe because it performs those abstract intellectual activities. So predicting the consequence of actions, that if I don't press the brake on my car in enough time while you're driving, not while you're thinking about driving, but while you're driving, if I don't press my brake in time, I will be too close to the semi-truck, and I may slide into it. So predicting the consequences of those actions is part of this prefrontal cortex. Your prefrontal cortex doesn't fully develop until you're like 25 or 26 years old. So a lot of times teenagers, because other parts of their body have grown and matured so much, they think they know it all. They think that they're completely matured because they have gone through puberty or are going through puberty, when really their prefrontal cortex is still in its elementary stage, if you will. So they'll do things and not really predict properly the consequence that would happen. So a lot of times, I know I've done a lot of stupid stuff as a teenager, and my mom and dad would say, weren't you thinking? Why weren't you thinking? And I didn't really have a response to that. It's like, no. And sometimes it's frustrating when you hear your teenagers say, well, I don't know why I did what I did. Well, part of it is that they really don't know. The prefrontal cortex is not fully developed yet, so they don't really predict the consequences of their actions quite yet. And even if you look at small children, like infants, my little 13-month-old, she's walking really well now, but she's got this thing where she tries to, if the gate's not up, and even, we put the gate up over the staircase, is that she sees everyone else going down the stairs, so for some reason she thinks because she can walk that she can go down the stairs as well. She's not predicting the consequence that she does not have the coordination yet to go from one step to the next, nor are her little legs long enough for that she's going to tumble all the way down those stairs. So, and they've even done studies where they'll take a 6-month-old baby and they put them on a table, and then it's glass, it's a glass covering that goes about 6 feet, and they'll put them on the solid part of the table, but when you look over the edge of it, it looks like they're going to drop off. So babies that are 6 months or younger that can crawl, I think it's between 9 and 6 months, they don't really predict the consequence of, if I keep going over this edge, I'm going to hurt myself. And those small babies between 6 and 9 months will continue to crawl out, even over the portion that looks like they should drop off and fall to the ground. down, but it's a safety procedure. It's just a glass, and it's just illusion that they would fall off. They don't. But you would still routinely see these babies moving off onto the glass. When they get a little bit older, at about 15 months, they will look over the edge and see that there's nothing there, and those babies wouldn't move. And I think it was almost like a 99.9% or 100% that these babies did not move from that spot because it looked like they were going to fall off. That's a direct picture of showing how their prefrontal cortex is starting to develop a little bit more. So left hemisphere, right hemisphere. Most people are what we call left-brained because that's their dominant hemisphere. It controls activities such as reading, writing, math, kind of those logical sorts of things, decision-making, speech, and language. If you are left hemisphere, a lot of times you are right-handed because there is the crossing of information of those tracks in your I'm losing my mind with the corpus callosum. So in that corpus callosum, there's that crossing of it. So if you're left hemisphere, you're usually right-handed. Right hemisphere, people that are very strong or right hemisphere dominated are much more kind of artistic. They have, a lot of times they're left-handed. They see things in a different way than sometimes left hemisphere dominated people are. Your senses of touch, smell, sight, tasting, all of those things are in your right hemisphere. The ability to recognize faces and to recognize voice inflections or to recognize other people's voices, that's part of your right hemisphere. And although keep in mind that this left hemisphere, right hemisphere, and we talk about right hemisphere dominant people and right brain people and left brain people, that keep in mind unless you've had your corpus callosum has been severed, you have the abilities on both sides of your brain because you use both your left and your right hemisphere. It's just that most people are dominantly using their left hemisphere. There are some folks that are using their right hemisphere as much or more than their left. So here is that crossing of that corpus callosum that is responsible for making sure that the information from both the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, that there is coordination between it. Back here in your occipital lobe, you have your visual cortex. Here's that general interpretive area for language and mathematics calculations, and notice it's found. It's only on one hemisphere, your left hemisphere, and it's found on the left one. Writing is also found on your left hemisphere. For some people, it's not only found in their left hemisphere, it's also found in their right hemisphere, so they can be either ambidextrous or left-handed. You have your prefrontal cortex here. Remember, that's the portion of your brain that helps you to predict the consequences of future actions. Synchronization is sort of a pacemaker mechanism that helps to synchronize the activities between your left and your right hemisphere. Any type of brain damage, which can happen from either a stroke or even through multiple seizures, can damage that synchronization and cause what we call desynchronization, where the left and the right hemispheres aren't really coordinating with one another very well. So there could be something that's seen and processed completely fine on the right hemisphere, like a face. They may recognize it completely fine, but then they're not able to send that information over to the left hemisphere to say, hey, that is my best friend Anne, or whatever. So you're not able to articulate that because let's go back at this picture. Remember that those speech centers are found over here in this left hemisphere. So even though you may visualize and say, that I know that's my friend Anne, and in your mind you're saying that's my friend Anne, but if you've had a stroke or there has been desynchronization that's happened or damage to the brain, then if someone asks you, who is that, it would be difficult for you to articulate that, or maybe it would be difficult for you to write that down, that, you know, this is my friend Anne. So that desynchronization just means it's an inability of the left and the right side of the brain to coordinate with one another. Seizures are temporary cerebral disorders, and it will show up as a change in the encephaloretiноgram. Small children, toddlers, and infants, sometimes if they get a fever, can sometimes develop a seizure. People that are epileptics will have seizures routinely, or this disruption in the cerebral processing. how the body is affected and the symptoms that we see for people that have seizures are going to vary depending on which region of the brain the seizure is located. Sometimes we've seen it with infants and toddlers that they've had a seizure and it's a one-time event, and we just don't ever see them have another seizure again. And we'll look at the EEG, the electroencephalogram, and we don't see anything on there, and we don't see any damages or disruption in electrical activities. All right, so the last little portion here is for the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system, as you will remember, is the part of the nervous system that you don't have to really think about. When we talk about somatic nervous system, it operates under conscious control. Somatic nervous system also controls your skeletal muscle. So anytime we talked about those portions of the brain, if they had a somatic job to them, it was controlling muscular movement primarily. Autonomic nervous system, remember, it operates without any conscious effort to it, so it coordinates the functions of your cardiovascular, respiratory, digestive, urinary, and reproductive function. None of these organ systems and the way they work do you have to consciously think about because it's under control of the ANS. So looking at this as a little bit of a roadmap on where we're going, general sensory receptors go through sensory pathways and it sends that information to the brain. Subconscious and conscious motor cells in the brain can then take that information on to the higher order portions of the brain, so memory, learning, and intelligence are affected in much the same way. Sensory processing centers in the brains can also bypass this and go to higher functions of the brain. The conscious and subconscious control centers of the brain can affect your motor pathways. If it affects your motor pathways and it affects your skeletal muscles, it goes through the somatic system. It affects your motor pathways for visceral functions, such as the movement of smooth muscles, cardiac muscles, glands, and even the activity of your fat cells, your adipocytes, and that would be the job of the autonomic nervous system. So what we're primarily concerned with is the autonomic nervous system in this portion of our notes. So it has two divisions, sympathetic and parasympathetic. Sympathetic increased alertness, metabolic rate, and muscular activities. You probably remember this or are most comfortable with calling it the fight or flight. So this would be your fight or flight division of your autonomic nervous system. And your parasympathetic division is kind of rest and digest, or rest and repose. So it reduces metabolic rate, promotes digestion. So it's bringing everything back down to kind of a normal standing. So right now you're sitting and listening at your computers or on your cell phones, and there's not really anything, you know, for you to be up in a tizzy about. So it's your parasympathetic division that's kind of doing its job. With the sympathetic division, if a bear were to come into the room or a wolf would to all of a sudden start howling at your door, then your fight or flight response will kick in on whether you run from the wolf or bear or if you try to fight it. Sympathetic division, as we said, kicks in only during exertion, stress, or emergency. For some people that have really severe test anxiety, even taking a test will kick in their sympathetic division and their body will start to respond as if it is being under attack. And then the rest and digest or rest and repose is the parasympathetic division. The 7 responses of increased sympathetic activity or of fight or flight, your mental alertness is increased, which is a very good thing on how focused you are, and it really is important in your decision making. You have an increased metabolic rate, so we want to break down all that glucose in your glycogen, the glycogen in your muscles and in your livers in order to get more energy for those cells to move and to function. Reduce digestive and urinary functions. Well, if you're running from a bear, it's really not that important that you're digesting food right now and that you're taking a pee. So the information and the energy that's devoted to that on a normal basis is now going to be reduced. Any of your energy reserves are activated, so once again, creatine phosphate reserves will be activated in skeletal muscle. Glycogen reserves in skeletal muscle in your liver will also be reserved or will be converted and used and activated. Increase in your respiratory rate. We need to get more oxygen in so we can get it to the cells so that we can make more energy. So to get more oxygen in, we need to have the dilation of our bronchioles or our respiratory passages to make them larger. Increased heart rate, we want to pump more blood to our skeletal muscles in order for them to have more energy to run or to fight. And then your sweat glands are also going to be activated. And we believe that the evolutionary role of having your sweat glands be activated is that you're slippery, and it's more difficult for someone or a predator, let's say a bear in this case, to try to get a hold of you because you're slippery. So that may be the vestigial evolutionary role for the activation of the sweat glands in sympathetic activity increase. In parasympathetic division, it's basically the opposite of what we saw in the sympathetic. Visceral activity is going to resume, so your digestive and urinary functions come back. We're going to start conserving that energy, so those glycogen reserves, all that glucose will be stored back into glycogen. It promotes kind of sedentary activities. Bring down that metabolic rate, heart rate, and blood pressure. Anytime your heart rate increases, blood pressure is usually going to increase as well because it's the volume of blood that's hitting the walls is going to be at a higher pressure when the heart is pumping very quickly than if it's pumping at its normal rate. Increased salivary and digestive gland secretion, we're going back to our digestion, so rest and digest. Increased motility and blood flow to the digestive tract, so once again we're bringing blood flow and the activities for digestion are taking place at their normal pace and speed, and then urination and defecation stimulation, you're kind of just back to normal here. I know some people, and I always have students that ask the question that, well, why is it that some people pee their pants when they get scared? Well, during the process of being scared, when they had that sympathetic sort of division that's happening, that's being activated there, chances are they probably had to already go to the bathroom. And since we're not directing activities and directing urinary function, when it's time to consciously control that external sphincter to say, whoo, I got to hold it and go to the bathroom, if you already have a full bladder and you're already kind of holding it, if you will, then when you get frightened, because we now need to focus and redirect all of the body's attention on fight or flight, then that sensation of having to go urinate, you like don't have, you lose a bit of that conscious control over it, and you're like, whoops, I had to go pee anyway, and then I wet myself. So it's not for everyone that happens, but it's not all the time. It's just usually if they've already had a full bladder and needed to go to the bathroom, that is why. But typically, under sympathetic division, urination and defecation, it's not a primary concern. But under parasympathetic, then it does, stimulation of that does occur. The final nervous system that we're going to talk about, we haven't really talked about it at all, and we'll probably not talk about it again until you guys get into AMP2 and you talk about the digestive system. And that's called the enteric nervous system. So it is the third division of the autonomic nervous system, and its whole job is to coordinate the digestive process. So it's an extensive network in the digestive walls. So digestion is a very complex process, so complex, in fact, that it has its own division of the autonomic nervous system that's devoted to it. You have roughly 100 million neurons that are responsible for coordinating the activities of digestion. So those complex visceral reflexes are controlled locally by those digestive organs and those neurons that are devoted to that process. And we call all of that the enteric nervous system. And what you'll find in the digestive system for AMP2 is not only do we have does the digestive system have its own nervous system division, but it's also got its own set of hormones that are released by only those digestive organs, stomach and the small intestine, the first portion of the duodenum. So it has its own kind of sub-nervous and sub-endocrine system that control digestion. All right, so that is the end of our notes. So that's all the notes that we will need. I have yet to put together your online exams for the last unit exam, but I will get that posted by this afternoon, hopefully before we meet each other for lab. I'll have that posted up this afternoon for you to take, and then you'll have until Friday at midnight to have that exam taken. And I will see you Monday labbers. I will see you later on this afternoon. And then my Tuesday lab folks, I will see, or Wednesday, I'm sorry, Wednesday lab folks, I'll see you guys on Wednesday. Have a great day, and I hope you had a really good Thanksgiving.